Chapter 3. The Nature of Our Mind. In the previous chapter we saw that what we call our mind is just a limited and distorted form of our original and fundamental consciousness I am, a spurious form of consciousness that identifies itself with a particular body, and that appears to exist only in the states of waking and dream, and disappears in deep sleep. Since this mind is the primary obstacle that stands in the way of our knowing ourself as we really are, let us now examine it more closely. What is the nature of this limited and distorted form of consciousness that we call our mind? Our mind as we know it is just a bundle of thoughts, that is, in the very broadest sense of the term, namely, anything that our mind forms and experiences within itself, such as any perception, conception, idea, belief, feeling, emotion, desire, fear, or such like. All thoughts are just images that our mind forms within itself by its power of imagination. Except our fundamental consciousness I am, each and everything that our mind knows or experiences is only a thought that it forms within itself. Even our perceptions are only thoughts or mental images that our mind forms within itself by its wonderful power of imagination. Whether perceptions in the waking state are formed only by our mind's power of imagination without any external stimuli, as in dream, or whether they are formed by our mind's power of imagination in response to actual external stimuli, is something we can know for certain only when we discover the ultimate truth about our mind. Because the fact that all our perceptions are only thoughts is so important, let us examine it a little more closely using the example of sight. According to the scientific explanation of the process of seeing, light from the outside world enters our eyeballs and stimulates electrochemical reactions in the light-sensitive cells at the back of them. These cells then stimulate a chain of further electrochemical reactions along our optic nerves, and these in turn reach our brain and cause more electrochemical activity to take place there. Thus far the process is very clear-cut and simple to understand. But then something mysterious happens. Our mind, which is a form of consciousness that interfaces with our brain, then somehow interprets all this electrochemical activity by forming images within itself that we believe to correspond to the shape, color, and size of external objects, and to their relative distance from our body. But all we actually know when we see something is the image that our mind has formed within itself. Our belief that such images correspond to actual external objects, and all our scientific explanations of the supposed process by which light from those objects stimulates our mind to form such images, are also only images, or thoughts, that our mind has formed within itself. The same applies to all the images of sound, smell, taste, and touch that our mind forms within itself, supposedly in response to external stimuli. Therefore, all that we know of the external world is actually only the images or thoughts that our mind is constantly forming within itself. Do we not have to accept, therefore, that the world that we think we perceive outside ourselves may in fact be nothing other than thoughts that our mind has formed within itself, just as the worlds that we see in our dreams are? Even if we are not ready to accept the fact that the world may actually be nothing but our own thoughts, must we not at least accept the fact that the world as we know it, and as we ever can know it, is indeed nothing but thoughts? Of all the thoughts that are formed in our mind, the first is the thought I. Our mind first forms itself as the thought I, and only then does it form other thoughts. Without an I to think or know them, no other thoughts could be formed. All the other thoughts that are formed in our mind are constantly coming and going, rising and then subsiding, but the thought I persists so long as our mind itself persists. Thus, the thought I is the root of all other thoughts, and is the one essential thought without which there would be no such thing as mind and no such action as thinking. Therefore, our mind consists of two distinct aspects, namely the knowing subject, which is our root thought I, and the known objects, which are all the other thoughts that are formed and experienced by this I. However, though it consists of these two distinct aspects or elements, the one fundamental and essential element of our mind is only our casual thought I. Hence, though we use the term mind as a collective term for both the thinker and its thoughts, our mind is, in essence, just the thinker, the basic thought I that thinks all other thoughts. This simple but important truth is expressed succinctly by Sri Ramana in verse 18 of Upadesa Undiyar. Our mind is only a multitude of thoughts. Of all the countless thoughts that are formed in our mind, the thought I alone is the root, base, foundation, or origin. Therefore, what is called mind is, in essence, just this root thought I. Just as on analysis our mind can thus be resolved into being, in essence, only this fundamental thought I, so on further analysis this fundamental thought I can in turn be resolved into being, in essence, only consciousness. Because it knows other thoughts, this thought I is a form of consciousness, but because it rises or is formed only by feeling, I am such and such a person, and because it subsides and loses its separate form in sleep, when it ceases to feel thus, it is not our permanent and real form of consciousness, our pure consciousness I am, because it can rise only by identifying a physical body as I, as it does in both waking and dream. It is a mixed and contaminated form of consciousness, a consciousness that confuses itself with the body, feeling mistakenly, I am this body, an individual person called so-and-so. What we mean when we say, I am such and such a person, is that we are an individual consciousness that identifies itself with an adjunct, a particular body. This identification of our consciousness with a particular body is what defines us as a person or individual. Our individuality or separate and distinct existence is thus nothing other than this adjunct-bound consciousness that feels, I am this body. By mistaking itself to be a particular body, this consciousness confines itself within the limits of that body and feels itself to be separate from all the objects and people it perceives outside that body. This seemingly separate individual consciousness, I am this body, is what we call by various names such as the mind, the ego, the psyche, or the soul, and it is the first thought that gives rise to and experiences all other thoughts. In religious terminology, our limited individual consciousness, I am this body, is what is called our soul, whereas our unlimited fundamental consciousness, I am, is what is called our spirit, our heart, or the core of our soul. The popular belief that our whole self is a compound of these three elements, our body, our soul, and our spirit, is rooted in a wrong identification of ourself with the particular body. Though we know ourself to be one because of our mistaken identification of ourself with the body, we wrongly imagine ourselves to be all these three different things. This notion of ours is logically absurd, because since we are one, how can three quite different things be ourself? Every day in sleep, both our body and our soul, our mind or individual consciousness disappear. Yet we continue to exist and to know that we exist. Therefore, since we remain in sleep without either our body or our soul, neither of these two elements can be our real self. In truth, therefore, These three elements constitute only our false individual self, which is a mere illusion, and not our real self. Our real self, our whole and complete self, does not consist of three elements, but of only one element, the fundamental and essential element that we call our spirit, which is our single non-dual consciousness of our own being, our true consciousness I am. Because this non-dual spirit is entirely distinct from our body and our individual soul, it is not limited in any way, nor is it divided. Therefore, the spirit that exists as the heart or core of each individual soul is essentially the same, single, undivided, non-dual, and infinite consciousness of being. What each one of us experiences as our own essential consciousness of being I am is the same non-dual real consciousness that exists in every other living being. Because our mind or soul is a form of consciousness that has limited itself within the confines of a particular body, and because it sees many other bodies, each of which seems to have a consciousness of its own, in the outlook of our mind there appear to be many other minds or souls. However, because the fundamental consciousness I am, which is experienced by each one of us as the essential core of our own being, always exists as it is, without limiting itself in any way by identifying itself with an adjunct, there is, in reality, only one consciousness I am, even though due to our distorted individualized consciousness, we think that the I am in each person is different to that in every other person. The mind or separate individual I that we see in each person is just a different reflection of the one original I that exists in the innermost depth of each one of us. Just as the bright light that we see in each fragment of a broken mirror lying on the ground is just a different reflection of the one sun shining brightly in the sky. Therefore, though it is formed only by our imagining itself to be a particular body, the mind of each one of us nevertheless contains within itself the light of our original non-dual consciousness I am. Just as each reflected sun lying on the ground could not be formed without borrowing the light of the sun and the limited form of a fragment of mirror, so without borrowing the light of consciousness from its original source I am, and without at the same time borrowing all the limitations of a physical body, our mind, our root thought I, could not be formed or rise into existence. Thus, our mind is a mixture composed of two contrary and discordant elements, the essential element of consciousness and the superimposed element of physical limitations. As Sri Ramana says in verses 24 and 25 of Uladu Narpadu, the inconscient body does not say I, Satchit being consciousness, that is, our fundamental consciousness of our own being I am, does not rise. That is, it does not newly appear or come into being. However, between these two, some spurious consciousness that feels itself to be I rises, imagining itself to be limited as the extent, dimension, size, or nature of a body. Now that this, the spurious consciousness that knows itself as I am this body, is Chit Jara Granti, the knot between consciousness and the inconscient matter, bondage, the soul, the subtle body, the subtle seed form of all the gross physical bodies that the mind creates for itself in waking and in dreams, the ego, the samsara, the mundane state of persistent activity, and the mind. Grasping form, a body, it comes into existence. Grasping form, that body, it persists. Grasping and feeding on form, thoughts, or objects, it flourishes abundantly. Leaving form, one body, it grasps form, another body. If we examine it, this formless phantom ego takes flight. Know, that is, know this truth or experience this disappearance of the ego by examining it. That is, our mind or ego is a spurious entity, an impostor that poses both as consciousness and as a body composed of inconscient matter. It seems to come into existence and to endure only by grasping an imaginary body as itself, and it feeds itself and flourishes by constantly attending to thoughts or imaginary objects. If we scrutinize it closely, however, it disappears, having no form or real existence of its own. As Sri Ramana says in verses 17 and 20 of Upadesa Undiyar, when we scrutinize the form of our mind without forgetfulness, interruption caused either by sleep or by thinking other thoughts, we will discover that there is no such thing as mind, separate from or other than our fundamental consciousness I am. For everyone, this is the direct path, the direct means to experience true self-knowledge. In the place, the state of our clear self-knowledge, where I, our mind or spurious individual consciousness merges by thus scrutinizing its own form, the one real being consciousness appears spontaneously as I am I. That itself is the whole of the unlimited and undivided reality. That is, when our mind or root thought I, this mixed and limited consciousness that feels I am this body, turns its attention inwards to scrutinize itself, it loses its grasp on its imaginary body and all its other thoughts. And since it has no separate form of its own, it subsides and disappears. What then remains, and is known in the absence of this spurious and limited consciousness, I am this body, is our one non-dual real and unlimited consciousness I am, which experiences itself not as I am this or I am that, but only as I am I. Whereas our adjunct-bound consciousness that feels I am this or I am that is a dual form of consciousness, our adjunct-free consciousness that feels only I am I is the non-dual, undivided, and infinite whole. Since it is infinite, nothing can truly be separate from or other than it. Anything that appears to be separate is merely a false appearance, an apparition or illusion, a figment of our own imagination. Hence, our true adjunct-free and therefore non-dual consciousness, I am I, is the sole truly existing reality, the one and only absolute reality. Sri Ramana also expresses this same truth in verse 2 of Anma Vidai. Since the thought, this body composed of flesh is I, is the one string on which all our various thoughts are attached, if we go within ourselves, scrutinizing who am I, what is the place, the source from which this fundamental thought I am this body rises? And all thoughts will disappear, and within the cave, the core of our being, self-knowledge will shine spontaneously as I am I. This alone is silence, the silent or motionless state of our mere being, the non-dual space of infinite consciousness, the sole abode of true unlimited happiness. The words nan ar idam edu, used here by Sri Ramana, can be taken to mean either one question, what is the place where I abide, or two questions, who am I, what is the place? Depending upon whether the word ar is taken to be an interrogative pronoun, meaning who, or a verbal adjective, meaning where I abide. As in many other instances in his teachings, Sri Ramana here uses the word idam, which literally means place or space, in a figurative sense to denote our real being or self, because our real self is the source or birthplace from which our individual sense of I arises, and because it is also the infinite space of consciousness in which our mind resides, since all other things are only thoughts that we form in our mind by our power of imagination. the infinite space of our non-dual consciousness of being, I am, is the original source and only abode, not only of our own mind, but also of all other things. When Sri Ramana says, the thought, this body composed of flesh is I, is the one string on which all our various thoughts are attached, what exactly does he mean by the word thought? In this context, the word thought does not mean merely a verbalized or conceptualized thought. It means anything that we form in our mind by our power of imagination. Everything that we form and experience within our mind is a thought or imagination. Whether we call it a thought, a feeling, an emotion, a desire, a fear, a belief, a memory, an idea, a conception, or a perception. In other words, any other form of objective knowledge or dualistic experience is a thought, an idea or image that we have formed in our mind. Of all our many thoughts, Sri Ramana says that the one basic thought that supports all our other thoughts is our thought or imagination that a particular body is ourself. Each of our other thoughts is linked directly to this basic thought, I am this body, and they are all held together by it, just as the pearls in a necklace are all held together by a string. This is, since the I that thinks all other thoughts is our mind, which creates and sustains itself by imagining itself to be a body. This fundamental feeling that we are a body underlies and supports every thought that we think. Whenever our mind is active, whether in waking or in dream, we always feel ourselves to be a body. Even when we daydream, whatever we imagine is centered around our basic imagination that we are a body. Even if we imagine ourselves being in some state of existence that is beyond this present material world, such as either heaven or hell, we imagine ourselves being some form of subtle or ethereal body in that other world. Though we now consider that the body that we experienced ourselves to be in a dream, or the body that we will experience ourselves to be in some other state, such as heaven or hell, is not a material body, but a more subtle body, a mind-created or ethereal body, when we actually experience such a body as in dream, we do not feel it to be a subtle body, but a solid material body, a body of flesh and blood. That is why Sri Ramana says, the thought this body composed of flesh is I, is the one string on which all our various thoughts are attached. The feeling or imagination that a particular body is ourself is the foundation upon which our mind and all its activity is based. In both waking and dream, we always feel ourselves to be a body. Our mind first forms itself by imagining itself to be a physical body, and then only can it think of any other thing. Like all our thoughts, this feeling that a body is ourself is an imagination. It is our first and fundamental imagination, our original and most basic thought, which Sri Ramana otherwise refers to as our root thought I. Whenever our mind rises, whether in waking or in dream, it always does so by imagining itself to be a body. Without this first imagination, we cannot imagine any other thought. Therefore, every other thought that we think depends entirely upon this first thought, I am this body. In fact, the basic and essential form of our mind is only this root thought, I, our deeply rooted imagination that we are a material body. So why and how does this imagination arise? It arises only due to our imaginary self-ignorance, because we first imagine that we do not know what we really are. We are then able to imagine that we are something that we are not. Since our mind, our finite individual consciousness, which arises by imagining itself to be a body, is an illusion that comes into existence due to our imaginary self-ignorance, it will be destroyed only when we experience true self-knowledge. That is, only when we experience ourselves as we really are. In order to experience ourselves thus, we must cease attending to any of our thoughts, and must instead attend keenly to our essential self-consciousness I am. When we do so, the clarity of our vigilant self-consciousness will dissolve the illusion of our self-ignorance, and hence we will cease to imagine ourselves to be a body or anything else that we are not. Since our basic imagination that we are a body will thereby be dissolved, along with it, all our other thoughts will also be destroyed. That is why Sri Ramana says in this verse, if we go within ourselves, scrutinizing, who am I? What is the place, the source from which this fundamental thought, I am this body, rises? All thoughts will disappear. And within the cave, the core of our being, self-knowledge will shine spontaneously as I am I. Since all our other thoughts depend for their seeming existence upon our first and fundamental thought, I am this body, and since everything that we know is other than ourself is just one of our thoughts, an image that we have formed in our mind by our power of imagination, when we discover that we are not this body but are only the adjunct, free, and therefore infinite non-dual self-consciousness I am, everything that appears to be other than this fundamental, essential self-consciousness will disappear, just as an imaginary snake will disappear when we discover that what we mistook to be that snake is in fact only a rope. Therefore, since our body and this whole world are only a series of thoughts or images that we have formed in our mind by our power of imagination, they will all disappear, along with our mind when we attain the non-dual experience of true self-knowledge. This truth is clearly implied by Sri Ramana in verse 1 of Anma Vidai. Though our self uninterruptedly and undoubtedly or imperishably exist as real, that is, though it is the one constant, indivisible, imperishable, and undoubtable reality, this body and world, which are unreal, sprout and arise as if real. When thought, our mind, which is composed of the unreal darkness of self-ignorance, is dissolved or destroyed, without reviving even an iota, that is, in such a manner that it can never revive even to the slightest extent, in the heart space, the innermost core of our being, which is the one infinite reality, our real self, which is the sun of true self-knowledge or consciousness, will indeed shine spontaneously, that is, by and of itself. The darkness of self-ignorance, which is the basis for the appearance of our mind, being the background darkness in which the cinema show of our shadow-like thoughts is projected, will thereby disappear. Suffering which we experience in this darkness of self-ignorance due to the intense activity of our thoughts will cease, and happiness, which is always our true and essential nature, will surge forth. In this verse, Sri Ramana emphatically states that our body and the world that we seem to perceive through it are both unreal, and he implies that they arise as mere thoughts in our mind. Since our mind, which is the sole cause for the seeming existence of both our body and this world, is composed only of thoughts, in this context he uses the word ninaivu, or thought, to denote it, and he describes it as poi mai ar, which means which is composed of unreal darkness, because it is formed from the darkness of self-ignorance, which is itself unreal, being nothing but an imagination. Our body and this world are both mere thoughts that we form in our mind by our power of imagination. And like all our thoughts, including our fundamental thought, I am this body, we imagine them due to the darkness of our self-ignorance. Therefore, when we destroy this darkness of self-ignorance by experiencing the absolute clarity of true, non-dual self-knowledge, our body, this world, and all other thoughts will be destroyed in such a manner that they will never reappear, even to the slightest extent. This state of absolute annihilation of our mind and all its progeny, all our thoughts, including our body, this entire universe and every other world that we imagine, is the state that Sri Ramana describes when he says, when thought which is composed of unreal darkness is dissolved or destroyed, without reviving even an iota, just as when the sun rises the darkness of night is dissolved by its bright light, so when the sun of true self-knowledge dawns, our mind, which is formed from the unreal darkness of self-ignorance, will be dissolved by the true light of our absolutely clear self-consciousness. Though Sri Ramana says in this verse, when thought is destroyed, he does not explicitly specify how exactly we can bring about this destruction of our mind. This is why in the next verse of Annihilation, which we discussed above, he first explains that all our thoughts depend upon our basic thought or imagination that a body is I. And he then says that if we penetrate within ourselves by keenly scrutinizing ourselves in order to know who am I, or what the source from which this thought that a body is myself originates, all other thoughts will disappear. That is, since the cause and foundation of all our thoughts is our basic imagination, that a body is ourself, we can destroy all our thoughts only by destroying this basic imagination. And since this basic imagination is an illusion, a mistaken knowledge about what we are, we can destroy it only by keenly scrutinizing it in order to discover the reality that underlies it. We cannot kill an imaginary snake by beating it with a stick, but only by scrutinizing it carefully in order to discover the reality that underlies it. Likewise, we cannot destroy our imaginary feeling that we are a body by any means other than keen self-scrutiny or self-attention. When we look carefully at a snake that we imagine we see lying on the ground in the dim light of night, we will discover that it is not really a snake, but is only a rope. Similarly, when we carefully scrutinize our basic consciousness I am, which we now experience as our mind, a limited consciousness that imagines itself to be a body, we will discover that we are not really this finite mind or body, but are only the infinite non-dual consciousness of our own being. When we thus experience ourself as being nothing other than our own absolutely non-dual self-consciousness I am, our primal imagination that a body is ourself will be destroyed, and along with it all our other thoughts will be destroyed, since they are merely shadows that can be formed only in the obscured and therefore limited light of self-ignorance. That is, though we allow our unlimited natural clarity of non-dual self-consciousness to be obscured by an imaginary self-ignorance, we never entirely cease to be conscious of ourself, and hence, in the dim light of our distorted self-consciousness, which we experience as our mind, the shadow play of our thoughts appeared to take place. However, since this shadow play is unreal, it can occur only in the dim light of our imaginary self-ignorance, and hence it will disappear in the clear light of true self-knowledge, in which we experience ourselves as the infinite consciousness of being that we always really are. Thus, in this second verse of Annihilation, Sri Ramana teaches us the truth that when we turn our attention within towards the core of our being, in order to know the true nature of our real I, which is the source from which our spurious, individual sense of I arises, we will discover that we are not this body composed of flesh, but are only the infinite space of non-dual being consciousness, which is the silent and peaceful abode of perfect happiness. Since all our thoughts depend for their seeming existence upon our mind, which is nothing but the spurious consciousness that imagines, I am this body composed of flesh, they will all disappear forever when we thus discover that we are not this body, but are only the non-dual infinite spirit, the one real self or Atman, which is the sole absolute reality. This non-dual infinite spirit is our adjunct-free and therefore unadulterated consciousness of our own true being, which in truth we experience eternally as I am. I am nothing but I am only what I am, or to quote the words of God in Exodus 3:14, I am that I am. The same truth that Sri Ramana expresses in the second verse of Anma Vidai is expressed by him in more mystical language in verse 7 of Sri Arunachala Ashtakam. If the thought I does not exist, nor the thing will exist, until then if any other thought rises, if responding to each such thought by investigation, to whom does this thought occur? To me, this fundamental thought I. What is the place from which this fundamental thought I rises, and in which it merges? We sink within ourselves and reach our heart seat, the innermost core of our being, which is the source from which all our thoughts rise. We will merge and become one with the Lord, under the shade of the unique umbrella, the non-dual infinite spirit, which outwardly manifests as God, the Supreme Lord of all that is. In that state of non-dual being, the dream of duality with all its imaginary pairs of opposites such as inside and outside, the two karmas, the two kinds of action, good and bad, death and birth, happiness and misery, and light and darkness will not exist. O boundless ocean of light of grace called Aruna Hill, who dance motionlessly within the court of our heart. The boundless ocean of light of grace called Aruna Hill, whom Sri Ramana addresses in this verse, is the non-dual infinite spirit which outwardly manifests as God, who is worshipped in the form of the holy hill Arunachala. This is not the place to answer the question why the non-dual spirit should be worshipped dualistically as an external form. But this question will be answered in the sequel to this present book. Suffice it to say here that Sri Ramana wrote this verse as part of a hymn written in the allegorical and poetic language of mystical love. The boundless ocean of light of grace called Aruna Hill is therefore an allegorical description of God, and he is said to dance motionlessly within the court of our heart, because he is our unlimited consciousness of being, which shines motionlessly yet vividly as I am in the innermost core of our being. The Lord under the shade of the unique umbrella is likewise an allegorical description of God, the Supreme Lord of all that is, whose reality is nothing but our infinite non-dual consciousness of being I am. Therefore, though Sri Ramana describes it allegorically in the language of dualistic devotion, what he is actually describing in the later part of this verse is only the state of perfect non-duality, which we can experience only when we put an end to our dream of duality. Our dream of duality is known only by our mind, our fundamental thought I, which is the limited consciousness that feels, I am this body. If we do not rise as this limited consciousness, we cannot know any duality, since all duality is only an imagination. It does not exist when we do not know it. Therefore, Sri Ramana begins this verse by stating the fundamental and all-important truth If the thought I does not exist, no other thing will exist. That is, all things depend for their seeming existence upon the seeming existence of our fundamental thought I, which is a limited and distorted form of our fundamental consciousness of being, I am. Therefore, in order to put an end to the illusory appearance of duality, we must put an end to the illusory appearance of our first and fundamental thought I. In this verse, Sri Ramana explains in a few very simple words how we can put an end to the illusory appearance of this primal thought I, since every thought that rises in our mind is formed and known only by our first thought I, and since our first thought I rises from and always depends upon our essential consciousness of being I am, whatever thought may rise, we can know it only because we first know I am. Thus, every thought can serve as a reminder to us of our own being. In order to show us how we can make the rising of any thought an opportunity for us to remember our being, Sri Ramana gives us the simple formula. To whom? To me. What is the place from which I rise? By giving us this formula, Sri Ramana does not mean that we should constantly question ourselves, to whom has this thought occurred? Only to me, what is the place from which this me has risen? What he means is that we should use any thought that rises to remind ourselves of our thinking mind, which we now feel to be I, because remembering this I that thinks and knows each thought will in turn remind us of our essential consciousness of our own being I am, which underlies the feeling that we are thinking and knowing thoughts, and which is thus the place or source from which our thinking mind arises. That is, whatever thought rises, we should remember, I know this thought because I am, and thereby we should turn our attention away from the thought towards our own essential consciousness of being, our real self-consciousness I am. When we thus turn our attention towards our consciousness of being, I am, our mind, which has risen to think thoughts, will begin to subside in our true self-conscious being, which is the source from which it has risen. If we are able to focus our attention wholly and exclusively upon our consciousness of being, our mind will subside completely into the innermost core of our being, and thus we will experience our own true being with absolutely unadulterated clarity of non-dual self-consciousness. When we once experience our true being with such perfect clarity, we will discover that we are the non-dual infinite spirit, and thus we will destroy forever the illusion that we are a body, a mind, or anything other than that spirit. When this illusion is thus destroyed, the dream of duality, which depends upon it, will also come to an end. This technique of using the rising of each thought to remind ourselves of our own essential being, which Sri Ramana explains very concisely in this verse, is explained by him in more detail in the 6th paragraph of Nanyar. Only by means of the investigation who am I, will our mind subside, shrink, settle down, become still, disappear, or cease to be. The thought, who am I, that is the effort we make to attend to our essential being, having destroyed all other thoughts, will itself in the end be destroyed like a corpse-burning stick, that is a stick that is used to stir a funeral pyre to ensure that the corpse is burnt entirely. If other thoughts rise without trying to complete them, we must investigate to whom they have occurred. However many thoughts rise, what does it matter? As soon as each thought appears, if we vigilantly investigate to whom it has occurred, to me will be clear. That is, we will be clearly reminded of ourself, to whom each thought occurs. If we thus investigate who am I, that is, if we turn our attention back towards ourself and keep it fixed firmly, keenly, and vigilantly upon our own essential self-conscious being in order to discover what this me really is, our mind will return to its birthplace, the innermost core of our being, which is the source from which it arose. And since we thereby refrain from attending to it, the thought which had risen will also subside. When we practice and practice in this manner, to our mind the power to stand firmly established in its birthplace will increase. That is, by repeatedly practicing, turning our attention towards our mere being, which is the birthplace of our mind's ability to remain as mere being will increase. When our subtle mind goes out through the portal of our brain and sense organs, gross names and forms, the thoughts or mental images that constitute our mind, and the objects that constitute this world appear. When it remains in our heart, the core of our being, names and forms disappear. Only to this state of retaining our mind in our heart without letting it go outwards is the name Mukam, I facing or self-attention, or Mukam, inward facing or introversion, truly applicable. Only to the state of letting it go outwards is the name Mukam, outward facing or extroversion, truly applicable. Only when our mind remains firmly established in our heart in this manner will our primal thought I, which is the root, base, foundation, or origin of all thoughts, go, leave, disappear, or cease to be, and will our ever-existing real self alone shine. The place, that is the state of reality devoid of even a little trace of our primal thought I, is Svarupa, our own form or essential self. That alone is called Mauna, silence. Only to this state of just being is the name Jnana Drishti, knowledge, seeing. That is the experience of true knowledge, truly applicable. That state which is just being is only the state of making our mind to subside, settle down, melt, dissolve, disappear, be absorbed, or perish in Atma Svarupa, our essential self. Besides this state of non-dual being, these states of dualistic knowledge, which are knowing the thoughts of others, knowing the 3 times what happened in the past, what is happening now, and what will happen in the future, and knowing what is happening in a distant place cannot be Jnana Drishti, the experience of true knowledge. Since our mind rises only by attending to thoughts, which it imagines to be other than itself, it subsides only by withdrawing its attention from all thoughts. Though our mind subsides in this way every day in deep sleep, and occasionally in other states such as swooning, general anesthesia, coma, bodily death, or in a similar state of subsidence brought about artificially by certain forms of meditation or by the yogic practice of breath control, in all such states it subsides without clear consciousness of its being. Therefore, in all such states, though we know I am, our consciousness of being is not perfectly clear. So though we know that we are, we do not know exactly what we are. Because we do not experience a perfect clarity of true self-knowledge or self-consciousness in such states of subsidence, our mind sooner or later rises again from such states, attending once again to its own thoughts, which it imagines to be other than itself. The reason why our consciousness of our being is not perfectly clear in such states is that our mind subsides in them merely by withdrawing its attention from its thoughts, but without focusing its attention clearly on itself. Only if we focus our attention wholly and exclusively upon our own consciousness of being I am, will our mind subside with perfect clarity of self-consciousness. If we are able to make our mind subside in this manner, we will not only know that we are, but also know exactly what we are. Since we thus experience a perfect clarity of true self-knowledge in that state, we will never again be able to mistake ourselves to be anything that we are not, and hence our mind will never rise again. Thus, the subsidence of our mind that we can achieve by attending to our consciousness of being will be permanent. The subsidence of our mind which Sri Ramana discusses in the above paragraph of Nanyar is not the usual dull and temporary form of subsidence that we experience in states like sleep, which we bring about by merely withdrawing our attention voluntarily or involuntarily from all thoughts, but is the clear and permanent form of subsidence that we can experience only in the state of true self-knowledge, which we can bring about only by focusing our attention intentionally upon our consciousness of our own being, I am. Therefore, when he says, only by the investigation, who am I, will the mind subside, he means that we can make our mind subside permanently and with full clarity of self-consciousness only by investigating, examining, inspecting, or scrutinizing our own consciousness of being, I am. Even though our essential being is eternally self-conscious, that is, even though we are always conscious of ourself as I am, so long as our mind is active, we will feel we have to make an effort to scrutinize or attend to our essential self-consciousness, our consciousness of our own being. Therefore, since self-attention involves an effort made by our mind, Sri Ramana refers to that effort as the thought, who am I, and says that after destroying all other thoughts, it will also be destroyed. Every thought that we form in our mind is a form of effort, because we can form and know any thought only by making an effort to do so. Because we think with great desire and enthusiasm, and because we are thoroughly habituated to doing so, it appears to us that we think effortlessly. However, thinking does in fact require effort, and therefore as a result of thinking, we become tired. Because thinking is tiring, our mind needs to rest and recuperate its energy every day, which it does by subsiding and remaining for a while in sleep. In sleep, our mind remains subsided temporarily in our own real self, our true state of self-conscious being, and because our real self is the source of all power, our mind is able to recharge its energy by remaining for a while in sleep. The energy or power that impels our mind to think is our desire to do so. Desire is the driving force behind all thought and all activity. Unless impelled by some desire, we do not think or do anything. When we make effort to attend to our consciousness of being, we do so because of our desire or love for true self-knowledge. When we repeatedly practice such self-attention, the clarity of our consciousness of our own mere being increases, and because of the happiness we find in such clarity, our love to attend to our being increases. Since this love to attend to our being is the power that enables us to do so, Sri Ramana says, when we practice and practice in this manner, to our mind the power to stand firmly established in its birthplace will increase. The more we experience the joy of just being, the less we will feel desire to think or do anything, and thus by the practice of self-attention, our tendency to think will be gradually weakened and will finally be destroyed. When we have no desire to think anything, we will remain effortlessly established in our own essential being, and thus even our effort to attend to our being will subside. This is what Sri Ramana means by saying that the effort to know who am I will destroy all other thoughts, and will itself finally be destroyed. Sri Ramana says, if other thoughts arise, without trying to complete them, we must investigate to whom they have occurred. What he means by saying that, what he means by saying that we should not try to make effort to complete a thought, is that we should not continue attending to it. Our thoughts rise only because we attend to them, and the more we attend to them, the more they flourish. If instead of thus allowing our effort or attention to flow outwards to think thoughts, we direct it inwards to another consciousness to whom those thoughts are known, the vigor with which we form our thoughts will begin to wane. Therefore Sri Ramana says, as soon as each thought appears, if we vigilantly investigate to whom it has occurred, to me, will be clear. The verb he uses to mean will be clear is tondrum, which also means will be visible, will appear, will spring up, will rise into existence, will come to mind, or will be known. So by the words to me will be clear, he means that we will be clearly reminded of ourself, the me, to whom each thought occurs. In other words, our attention will turn back on itself, away from the thought that it had begun to think. Though the me who knows thoughts is not our real self, our being consciousness, but is only our mind, our spurious knowing consciousness or rising consciousness, when we turn our attention towards it, it will automatically subside in and become one with our being consciousness. This is what Sri Ramana means when he then says, if we thus investigate, who am I? Our mind will return to its birthplace. Because he first says, if we vigilantly investigate to whom this thought has occurred, and then in the next sentence says, if we investigate, who am I? Some people wrongly mistake him to mean that we should first ask ourselves to whom each thought has occurred, and that after remembering that it has occurred to me, we should then ask ourselves who this me is, or who am I? In fact, however, since by the mere remembrance of me, our attention turns back towards ourself, we do not then need to do anything further except to keep our attention fixed on ourself. Since we can investigate who am I only by scrutinizing or attending to our consciousness of our own being, which we always experience as I am, the mere remembrance of the me to whom each thought occurs is itself the beginning of the process of investigating who am I. Thus, all we need do after remembering that this thought has occurred to me is to keep our attention fixed on that me. Therefore, we can best understand the connection between these two sentences by interpolating the words thus or continue thus too. If we thus investigate who am I, or if we continue thus to investigate who am I, even if we choose to interpolate the word then instead of the word thus, we should still understand this then in the sense of then continue to, if we then continue to investigate who am I. That is, we should not understand this clause to mean if we then initiate a fresh process of investigation by newly thinking who am I, but should understand it to mean if we then continue this state of investigation which we initiated when we remembered me by keeping our attention firmly and keenly fixed on our self-conscious being I am. When Sri Ramana says, if we thus investigate who am I, our mind will return to its birthplace. What exactly does he mean by saying that our mind will return to its birthplace? In this context, the term birthplace denotes the source from which our mind has risen, which is our fundamental consciousness of our own being. I am. Since our mind seemingly rises or leaves its birthplace only by attending to thoughts, which it forms by its power of imagination, but which it imagines to be other than itself, it returns to its birthplace only by withdrawing its attention from all its thoughts. However, if we are not only to return to our birthplace, but also to be fully conscious of that place or natural state of being to which we are thus returning, we must not only withdraw our attention from all our thoughts, but must also turn it back towards ourself, focusing it keenly upon our essential consciousness of our own being. Thus, when Sri Ramana says that our mind will return to its birthplace, he means that our attention will turn backwards towards our natural self-consciousness, and thus our mind will subside in that perfectly clear consciousness of our own being. Our mind is in fact nothing but our power of attention. When we direct our power of attention towards thoughts and objects which we imagine to be other than ourself, we rise as our mind, leaving our natural state of mere being. But when instead we direct our power of attention back towards ourself, we return to our natural state of mere being, and so long as we keep our attention fixed on ourself, without allowing it to stray out towards anything else, we remain as our mere being, that is, as our own essential self. In other words, our outward-facing attention is our mind, whereas our inward or I-ward-facing attention is our real self, our own simple and essential self-conscious being. Our power of attention, which is our power of consciousness or knowing, is not anything separate from us. It is ourself, our own true and essential being. In other words, we, ourself, are the power of attention or consciousness by which all is known. When we misuse our power of consciousness by imagining that we are knowing things other than ourselves, we seemingly become the separate and therefore finite individual consciousness that we call mind. But when we do not misuse our power of consciousness in this manner, we remain as we always really are, as the true infinite non-dual consciousness of our mere being I am. When we thus remain as our true consciousness of our own mere being, we experience ourself as I just am. But when we imagine ourselves to be a separate individual consciousness or mind, we experience ourselves as I am this, or I am that. I am this body, I am a person. I am so-and-so. I am such and such. I am knowing. I am doing, and so on and so forth. Our mind and all that it knows or experiences is therefore just an imaginarily distorted and limited form of our own natural non-dual consciousness of being I am, which is our true self. What we call attention is the power that we as consciousness have to direct or focus ourself. When we focus our consciousness upon itself, that is, when we focus ourself upon ourself, upon our mere self-conscious being, we experience the true knowledge, I just am. But when we focus ourselves on our consciousness upon anything other than our own essential self, we experience the false knowledge, I am knowing this thing other than myself. This focusing of our consciousness upon anything other than ourself is what we call imagination, because everything other than our own essential self-conscious being I am is merely a thought or image that we have formed in our mind by our power of imagination. Since this imagination, which is another name for our mind, causes us to delude ourselves into experiencing things that do not truly exist, it is also called Maya, a word that means delusion or self-deception. Thus, our mind or object-knowing attention is merely a product of our own self-deceiving power of imagination, which is the distorted use that we make of our power of consciousness when we use it to imagine that we are experiencing anything other than ourself. Because our attention is the focusing of our entire being upon something, it has tremendous power. In fact, it is the only power that truly exists, and it is the source from which all other forms of power arise. From our experience in dream, we know that by misusing our power of attention to imagine and know things other than ourselves, we can create an entire world and delude ourselves into mistaking that world to be real. Since we know that we can create a seemingly real world by our mere power of imagination and dream, we have no valid reason to suppose that the world we experience now in this so-called waking state is anything other than a creation of our same power of imagination. Thus, our attention has the power to create a world that does not truly exist, and in the process of doing so, it deludes us into mistaking that world to be real. All the power that we see in the world that we imagine to be outside ourselves appears to exist only because of our power of attention. All that we experience appears to be real only because we attend to it. Since our attention is so powerful, it is a dangerous weapon that we should use carefully and wisely. The wise way to use our power of attention is to know ourselves. Until we know the truth of ourselves, who know all other things, we cannot know the truth of anything else. To know ourselves, we must attend to ourselves, to our essential, self-conscious being, I am. Other things appear to come into existence only when we attend to them, and they disappear when we cease attending to them. This is why Sri Ramana says, when our subtle mind goes out through the portal of our brain and sense organs, gross names and forms appear. When it remains in our heart, names and forms disappear. What exactly does he mean when he says this? When we attend to or know anything that is seemingly other than our consciousness of being, we feel that our mind or attention is going outwards, away from ourselves. When our attention thus goes outwards, it does so either through just the portal or gateway of our brain, or through the portals of both our brain and one or more of our 5 sense organs. When our attention goes out only through the portal of our brain, we experience thoughts that we recognize as existing only within our own mind. But when our attention goes out still further, not only through our brain but also through our sense organs, we experience objects that we imagine to exist outside and independent of our mind. Sri Ramana describes both the thoughts that we recognize as existing only within our own mind and the objects that we imagine to exist outside our mind as names and forms, because every thought is just a mental form or image, and every external object is likewise just a form or image that we experience in our own mind. And because we give or can give a name to every form that we know, thus in this context, the word names denotes our verbalized thoughts, whereas the word forms denotes our pre-verbalized thoughts. However, since our verbalized and pre-verbalized thoughts are intimately associated and interwoven, the distinction between them is blurred, and hence, in Indian philosophy, they are regarded as an indistinguishable whole, which is expressed by the compound word namarupa, which means name-form. Because all the thoughts that we think and all the objects that we know are nothing but names and forms, this compound word namarupa, or name-form, is frequently used in Advaita Vedanta to denote collectively all thoughts and all external objects. One important reason why this term namarupa is thus used so frequently to denote all thoughts and external objects is that it clearly distinguishes them from our essential consciousness of being I am, which is nameless and formless, because it has no definable form and is therefore beyond all mental conception. Since our mind is in essence mere consciousness, and since it therefore has no form of its own, Sri Ramana describes it as subtle, whereas he describes all thoughts and external objects as gross, because they are all mere forms, images that we form in our mind by our power of imagination. We form all such mental images only by allowing our mind or attention to go outwards away from ourself. Therefore, when we retain our attention within ourself, not allowing our mind to rise to know anything other than I am, all such mental images disappear. This is what Sri Ramana means when he says, when it remains in our heart, names and forms disappear. By the word heart, he means only the core of our being, which is our own fundamental and essential self-consciousness I am, and which is the source or birthplace of our imaginary mind. Sri Ramana describes this state of retaining our attention in our heart or the core of our being as introversion. But while doing so, he significantly uses not just one but two Sanskrit terms to denote introversion. The second of these two terms is antarmukam, which is the term most commonly used in both Sanskrit and Tamil philosophical literature to denote introversion, and which is a compound of two words, antar and mukam. The word antar means within, inside, internal, interior, or inward, while the word mukam means face, direction, facing, turning towards, turned towards, or looking at. Thus, the compound word antarmukam means facing inward, looking inward, turned inward, or directing attention inward. The first of the two terms that he uses to describe the state of introversion is Aham Mukam, which is a more rarely used term, but which is actually more meaningful than antarmukam. Like antarmukam, Aham Mukam is a compound of two words, Aham and Mukam. In Sanskrit, the word Aham means only I. But in Tamil, it not only means I or self, but also from another root it means inside, mind, heart, abode, home, house, place, or space. Thus, the compound word Aham Mukam means not only introversion, but also more specifically facing I-ward, facing selfward, looking selfward, turn selfward, or directing attention towards I. Sri Ramana then goes on to say that when our mind or attention thus remains firmly established in our heart, or hidraya, the innermost core of our being, our first and fundamental thought I will vanish, and only our ever-existing real self will shine or be known. That is, when we are able to keep our attention firmly fixed in our consciousness of being, the clarity of self-consciousness that we experience in that state, the clarity of self-consciousness that always exists in our heart, but which we experience only when we keep our attention firmly fixed upon it, will destroy forever our tendency to rise as the thought I, the spurious individual consciousness that imagines itself to be a body, and thus our real and essential self will remain alone, shining clearly as I am or I am I. In order to emphasize the fact that the non-dual reality which alone remains after our individual consciousness I has ceased to exist is not anything alien to us, but is only we, ourself, in the original Tamil text, in the final and main clause of this sentence, our ever-existing self alone will shine. Sri Ramana highlighted in bold type the pronoun tan, which means self or ourself. Though we always experience this ever-existing self as I am, it will destroy our mind or individual consciousness only if we fix our attention firmly upon it. Sri Ramana then describes our essential self, or svarupa, as being the place in which not even the slightest trace of the thought I exists. That place is our heart, the innermost core of our being. He refers to it figuratively as a place for two reasons. Firstly, because it is the source or birthplace of our mind, and of all the progeny of our mind, namely its thoughts and the objects that constitute this world, and secondly, because we experience it as the core of our being, the central point in the space of our mind, and the point from which we conceive all thoughts and perceive all external objects. Besides being described as a place, it can also be described as a state, because it is the state of perfect egolessness, the state in which we experience only our pure, uncontaminated, and adjunctless consciousness of mere being, I am. Sri Ramana also describes this place or state of egolessness as being Mauna, or silence, because it is the state of perfectly silent or motionless being. Since our real self is thus the state of perfect silence, we can know it only by remaining silent, that is, by just being without rising to think anything. That is, since the restless activity or chattering of our mind is the noise that prevents us from knowing the silence of pure being, we can experience that silence only by silencing all our mental activity. Therefore, silence in this context does not mean mere silence of speech, but complete silence of mind. Sri Ramana further describes this state of silence or egoless being as the state of just being, the Tamil word that he uses to mean just being, or Summa Irupadu. The word Summa is an adverb meaning just, merely, silently, quietly, peacefully, restfully, leisurely, without doing anything, motionlessly, freely, or continuously, while Irupadu is a gerund or verbal noun meaning being, from the root iru, which is an imperative that means be. This term Summa Irupadu is a key concept in Tamil philosophical literature, and its imperative form, Summa Iru, which means just be, is considered to be the ultimate and most perfect form of spiritual instruction. The reason for the preeminence given to this term is that it expresses as perfectly as any words can express the state of true self-knowledge, which is the state of perfect silence. Sri Ramana defines it simply as making our mind to subside, settle down, melt, dissolve, disappear, be absorbed, or perish in Atma Svarupa, our own essential self. The Sanskrit word Atman, which is used in Tamil in various modified forms such as Atma, Attuma, and Anma, means self, spirit, life, soul, mind, supreme spirit, essence, or nature, and is also used as the singular reflexive pronoun for all three persons and all three genders: oneself, myself, yourself, himself, herself, or itself, or as the genitive form of the reflexive pronoun in the sense one's own, my own, and so on. In a spiritual context, Atman means our real self, our spirit or essential being, which is also called Brahman, the supreme spirit or absolute reality, the essence or soul substance of all things. The Sanskrit word Svarupa, which in Tamil is usually modified as Sarupam, is a composite noun formed of two parts: Sva, which means own, one's own, my own, your own, his own, her own, its own, our own, or their own, and Rupa, which means form, appearance, image, or nature. Thus, the compound word Atmasvarupa literally means oneself's own true nature. That is, the true nature of our own real self, which is our mere consciousness of being, our essential self-consciousness I am. Since our mind is our false self, a spurious form of consciousness that we mistake to be ourself, we can effect its dissolution only by fixing our attention firmly in our real self, the innermost core of our being, which we always experience as our fundamental and essential consciousness I am. When we dissolve our mind thus in our real own self, the true nature of our real self will reveal itself as mere being. Being which is silent, peaceful, and devoid of any movement or activity. This state in which we thus dissolve our mind in our real self is therefore described as Summa Irupadu, the state of just being. That is the state in which we merely are as we truly ever are, devoid of even the least activity or doing.